Good morning, GBC. My name is Benjamin Boveroff, if you don't know me, and I'm one of the deacons here. And I have the pleasure of reading this morning's passage, which is 2 Samuel 11, 1 through 15, if you could turn there on your device or your physical Bible. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness, and then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent a word to David, saying, "I am pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. And when Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants, and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it to Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front, where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die."
Thanks, Ben. Well, hey there, everyone. If I don't know you, my name is Brian. I'm one of the pastors here at GBC. Excited to be with you today as we continue a series we started last week called Heroes, where we're taking some time to look at how God can use us to be a source of life and flourishing in the world the same way that He did Jesus. And in order to do that, we're going to be in the passage that was just read for us in 2 Samuel, chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. That's found in the first portion of the Scriptures called the Old Testament, where if you look in your table of contents on your hard copy Bible or your list in your device, you'll see that there, and you'll head to chapter 11, verses 1 through 15. And everything we're talking about today has to do with a simple question that goes, who am I? I think that's one of the most important questions that we try to answer as human beings. Who am I? And it's why we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to answer that question. And if you pay attention, the most popular way in our current cultural moment that we answer that question, who am I? What's my identity? How am I supposed to live? Is done in 3 steps. The first step to answer the question of who are you is to look inside of yourself. Who am I? Well, I need to look inside of my heart, and I need to find my deepest feelings and my deepest desires and my deepest wants, and that's who I am. I am what I feel. I am what I want. I am what I desire. You can see this in the fact that one of the most prevalent pieces of advice that we give to people in our current moment when they're trying to figure out what to do in any given situation is just follow your heart. Do what feels right to you, because we are what we feel. And once you figure out what you feel, the second step in determining who you are is you live those feelings out. You express those desires. You can see this in the fact that we are consistently looking at people and saying, you can do whatever you want to do. Whatever you set your heart to, just make it a reality. And I'm just going to say, if my son wants to be a linebacker in the NFL, if you look at me, he doesn't have much hope of that. But anyway, like that's the second step. Second step of your identity is live out those desires, because if you are what you feel, then to be true to yourself, you need to live those things out. Now, if you're tracking with me, that creates a very important conclusion that says if I am what I feel, and the way that I express my identity is living out those feelings, then to be told I can't live out those things is an attack on my identity. Where if someone comes along and says you cannot live out that desire or you cannot live that feeling, that's not just a restriction, that is an attack on our very identity. It's an attack on who we are. It's an attack on my humanity, because according to this idea of how you determine identity, no external force gets to force any kind of definition on yourself. You get to determine that. So the third step in answering the question of who am I is to surround yourself with people in your life who will affirm your feelings and support you in your pursuit of them. Like the last step to determining who you are and living out that identity is to make sure that the people you have in your life will affirm your desires, support you pursuing them, and if they won't, you need to cut them out of your life. And the question we need to ask, that a lot of us aren't willing to ask in this moment right now in our culture, is whether or not that means of forming identity produces flourishing and life among human beings or creates brokenness and struggle. Does this means of building identity, this idea that I am what I feel, does that create flourishing or brokenness? And I think the Scriptures speak into that question in a very important way, and we see it in our story today. The main character of our story is quite possibly the greatest king of ancient Israel. He's a guy by the name of David, and he's known for doing things like killing this giant named Goliath. He's known for killing bears and lions with his bare hands. He's known for writing a lot of ancient Israel's worship songs, which are called the Psalms. But most importantly, probably, is that he's known for the fact that when he was anointed to be the king of Israel, he's given the nickname of being a man after God's own heart. Sounds like hero material, doesn't it? Like he sounds like someone that kids should put on a poster on the wall in their room, like I did growing up with my favorite sports players and different things like that. Only when you read this story, he's not a hero. Like, tell me David wouldn't be canceled in our day and age for what we read going on in this passage. He's not a hero. He is broken. He's capable of some ridiculous and broken things as a human being, but I'm convinced that if we'll look at David's story here and we'll learn from him, we can see how we can combat some of this brokenness and be sources of life in our world the way that Jesus was. So here's the first thing I want you to notice in our text. We all have desires. It's the first thing I want you to see. All of us as human beings have desires. We want certain things. We feel like we need certain things in our lives that we don't necessarily need most of the time. We have desires. You can see this right at the beginning of our story. It says, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a young woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. I want to name two really important things before we continue our conversation. The first thing that I want to name for you is that if you were listening to our story being read and you felt gross or you felt disgusted, that's a good thing because you should. Like if you were listening to this story and you were reading it and you were ill, yes, that's fine. You should feel that way. This story has some creepy and disgusting things in it, and I just want to name that. Like, I'm not going to keep naming the creepy, disgusting things. Just want to name that for all of us. Second thing that I want to name is this. Bathsheba is not responsible for anything that happens in this story whatsoever. Bathing on the roof, her bathing on her roof, she's not being provocative, she's not flaunting anything. That was a typical thing that women would do in her culture. In fact, she's probably not the only woman bathing on her roof at this time of day. That, and you also have to understand that she had no choice in anything that happens to her in this text. She had no ability to deny the king what he wanted, which has led many Christian theologians and pastors to correctly conclude that what happens to Bathsheba in this text is rape. Any attempt to try and save face for David by putting responsibility for things in this text on Bathsheba should be roundly rejected. Now, with both of those things named, David is on the roof of his palace one day and he's walking around. and he sees this beautiful woman, and this beautiful woman creates in him a desire to sleep with her. Like David sees this beautiful woman, he's a king, she's in his kingdom, and he desires to have sex with her. And I want you to realize that we're just like David. We have desires in our lives just like David did. The question that we have to ask about our desires is, what are we supposed to do with them? Because it's been my experience in my life that my desires aren't neutral. They demand that I do something about them. I either fulfill the desires that I have or I reject them. I have to do one or the other. So, for example, I have had moments in my life where I have desired to say something hurtful to my wife. And in that moment, that desire demands that I either fulfill that desire or I reject it. It's the same thing with David here. He has a desire to sleep with this beautiful woman, and that desire requires him to either fulfill it or reject it. And the same can be said about positive desires, right? Like I've also had the desire in my life to serve my wife by doing the dishes. And the question you have to ask is, what determines whether or not, what determines what I do with that desire? What determines whether or not I fulfill it or reject it? Well, you could say that maybe circumstances should determine whether you fulfill or reject a certain desire. So, does my wife deserve for me to say something hurtful to her, or doesn't she? If she deserves it, then I should. If she doesn't, then I shouldn't. Or maybe it's benefits of fulfilling or rejecting a desire. So I could do a cost-benefit analysis on whether or not it's more costly or better for me to do the dishes for my wife, and if it's better for me to do them, then I'll do them, and if it's not, I won't. And I could go on and on and on about different ways that we could say, here's how we determine whether I should fulfill or reject a certain desire, but I'm not going to do that because in our story, we see the answer to the question of how do we know what to do with our desires. Look what happens after David sends someone to find out about Bathsheba. It says, the man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Another way that you could translate that sentence is you could actually translate it as a question, where this messenger who went to check out on Bathsheba, they didn't have Facebook back then, so David couldn't creep her on her Facebook page, had to do it the way he was doing it that day, sent a message to find out who she was, and this messenger comes back and he says, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Now that response should tell David exactly what he's supposed to do with that desire to have sex with Bathsheba. That's all he needs to know whether he should fulfill or reject that desire, because God has told him what to do with that desire. In other words, what I'm trying to get across is the way you know what to do with your desires is you look at what God has said to do with them. God has told you whether to reject or fulfill every desire that you have in your life, and the way you answer that question is by looking at what God says. So, let's talk about that specifically in the thing that is in the forefront of our text. Whoops, I did it already. So that was fun. Great way to start this conversation, right? Sex, it's at the forefront of our text. So let's talk about God's plan for it. First thing we have to realize about sex is that it's a good thing. Sex is a good thing. It's not evil. It is not dirty. It is a good gift given to us by God. It brings pleasure into our lives. It builds connection and deep bonds between human beings. It's the source of creating life itself in our world, and it's very powerful. Powerful enough that it can cause us as human beings to do some pretty ridiculous things like we see going on in our text. And David knew this. He knew this because according to ancient Jewish law, adultery was expressly forbidden. In fact, if you committed adultery, the punishment for doing so could be death. And the reason that was the law in ancient Israel was because of what God's plan for sex is. And we find that right away at the very beginning of the Scriptures, where God creates the first human being named Adam. And God parades all of the rest of the beings in creation before Adam to show him that he doesn't have an adequate partner. And so he puts Adam to sleep, and while Adam's sleeping, he creates Eve, the first woman, out of Adam. And when Adam wakes up, God brings Eve to Adam. Adam is all excited about this woman who's in front of him now. And here's what we read in Genesis 2, verse 24. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. This verse sets the course for what the rest of the scriptures are going to say about God's plan for sex, and that is that God says the only proper way that we as human beings should fulfill our sexual desire in life is within the confines of marriage between one man and one woman. For thousands of years, the people of God from all cultures, in all times, in all places, all around the world, have agreed that God's plan for sex is that it takes place within the confines of marriage between one man and one woman. What that means then is that if we as human beings fulfill sexual desire in any way outside of the confines of marriage between one man and one woman, we are not in keeping with God's plan for sex. It's wrong. It's sinful. It's rebellion against God. And so here's what I want to do. This is where it might get uncomfortable if you're not already uncomfortable. I'm just going to make sure you get there this morning. And I just want to be clear about this because we at GBC believe that clarity is kindness. If God's plan for sex, if He says that the only way we as human beings should fulfill sexual desire is within the confines of marriage between one man and one woman, then homosexuality, whether in a committed, monogamous, one-to-one person relationship or any other kind, is not within God's plan for sex and is therefore sinful. Now, some of you might be uncomfortable with that because some of you want me to go a little harder on that, like you want me to go all hellfire and brimstone right now, and others of you are uncomfortable because you're looking at me and saying, dude, I don't think you've gotten that one right. But for all the time that we spend as Christians talking about whether or not homosexuality is a sin, which our position as a church is that it is, we probably don't spend enough time talking about the fact that any other expression or fulfillment of sexual desire outside of God's plan is just as sinful. So what that means is that lust as a fulfillment of sexual desire is just as sinful as homosexuality. Pornography is just as sinful. Hear me, a heterosexual couple having sex outside of marriage is just as sinful. So let's just recap. Let's just make sure we're all on the same page, all right? Sex is a good gift from God. It is not evil. It is not dirty. In fact, sexual desire itself is a good thing. You realize God does not hold you morally responsible for your desires. It is natural for you to have sexual desire for other people. We all have, most of us at least, have sexual desire to varying degrees, obviously. But the desire isn't bad. What God holds us morally responsible for is how we fulfill those desires. And what He said is that the way we as human beings should fulfill sexual desire is only within the confines of marriage between one man and one woman. If that's the case, then any way that we fulfill sexual desire outside of that plan is wrong, rebellion against God, and therefore sinful. Now, if that creates questions for you, like how did we as a church come to that conclusion, or how do we function in light of that sort of thing? Like if you've got any questions at all, you know how to get a hold of me. I am right down here. You can email me. You can call me. Let's go have lunch, because I promised y'all last week that this sermon wasn't only going to be about sex and sexuality, right? So we need to move on. But if you've got questions, I want to continue the conversation, so come talk to me, all right? We on the same page there? Because what I'm trying to get you to see in this whole conversation about sex is that God has laid out good plans for how we as people should fulfill the desires that we have in our lives. And when we fulfill desires outside of God's plan for them, it only ends badly for us. You only need to look at David to see that. So David gets this not so subtle hint that Bathsheba is off limits. And we're told, then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. David acts on his desire in a way that God has said that he shouldn't. And what I want us to reflect on here for a second is why he might have done that. David is a king. and what happens when a king wants something that's in his kingdom. He gets it, right? Like, I'm the king, this woman is in my kingdom, and I want her, and because I'm the king, I should get what I want. Now, you and I might not be kings and queens, but you and I buy into that mentality a lot, if we're honest with ourselves. In fact, we are being told on a regular basis in our culture that the way towards life, the way to live a flourishing human existence, is to gratify every desire that we have. In fact, we are being told that self-gratification is the way to life, to the extent that if you deny yourself different desires, or you deny yourself different feelings, it's actually harmful for you, unless fulfilling those desires and gratifications and feelings would be harmful for others. And I want you to know that that idea, that flourishing life comes from self-gratification, is the opposite of what Jesus lays out for us. Just look at what Jesus says in Matthew 16, 24 through 26. These are Jesus' words. If anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me will find it. Notice what Jesus is saying. The way you will find your life as a human being is not through gratifying all of your desires. It's actually through denying yourself and following Jesus. And part of that self-denial is to refuse to gratify certain desires in our hearts that God has said we should not gratify. Put as plainly as I can for you. The way to flourishing human life is not through self-gratification, it's through self-denial. If you want to live a flourishing human life, it is not found in self-gratification, it is found in self-desire. I know that sounds insane, but the gospel itself is founded in self-denial. You realize that? Like, Jesus denied himself, took up his cross, and died on our behalf. Because without him, we'd have no desire for God. Like, we have so set our hearts against God, wanting to be our own little kings and queens and gratify all of our desires, that we've rebelled against him. We don't want anything to do with his plan for things in our lives. And it's because of that without God, none of us would have wanted anything to do with him ever and would have spent all of eternity living in the brokenness that causes for us. But praise his holy name, God wasn't satisfied with that. And so the Father sent the Son through the Holy Spirit in Jesus to die on a cross, paying for our sin, and then purchase the victory over our sin for us when he resurrected 3 days later, so that if you and I will place our trust in him as our Savior, we can have the eternal flourishing life that comes from living in the presence of God where we were created to live in the first place. What that means, the gospel is showing us that the way to life is through self-denial and following after Jesus. Now, what that means, really practically, is that you can live a completely flourishing life with Jesus and not gratify a single desire that you have. Let me press that. You can live a completely flourishing life with Jesus without sex and romance. Again, I know that sounds insane, especially in a culture where sex and romance have been elevated to the pinnacle of the human experience. But what the scriptures say is that you can have a flourishing life without gratifying any of your desires, including sex and romance. Now, some of you are looking at me and saying, bro, that's easy for you to say. You're married. You're a married man. You're in the confines where you get to gratify those desires. Yeah, you're right. I'll give you that. But what I'll also tell you is that as a married man, I know that when I start looking at my wife as the object that gets to satisfy my desires, I start treating her as an end, as a means to an end, just like David did Bathsheba. Like, if I start looking at my wife as the means through which I get to gratify my sexual desire, I begin to treat her as an object rather than treating her as a human being who deserves to be served, cared for, and cherished. And I'm telling you that if you live your life seeking to gratify all of your own desires, that will inevitably happen to you. You will start to see everything in your life, including those you love most, as a means to the end of gratifying yourself. You mix that together with gratifying those desires in ways that God says you shouldn't, and you have the recipe for the kind of nonsense that David got himself into in our text. And the reason that David got himself into that nonsense was because he thought he knew better than God. See, if we live with a mentality that says, I'm going to satisfy my desires, we will eventually start living with a mindset of doing what looks good in our eyes. Now, let's rewind. If you were with us last week, do you remember how our world got into the mess that it is in the first place? It got here because a fellow human being looked at something that she saw as good in her eyes and took it when God said it wasn't hers to take. David sees something that looks good in his eyes and takes it, even though God said that Bathsheba wasn't his to take. And you see this theme all throughout the Scriptures, and there's even a couple of places where it just explicitly says it. There's a couple places in the Scriptures that says everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. And I'm telling you, when you find that phrase in the Scriptures, what's going on around it isn't good. Like when you find the phrase, everyone was doing what was good in their own eyes, and you start looking at what's going on around everyone at that time, it's absolutely horrific. So what we can learn from David then is how to effectively combat the brokenness that comes in our lives when we gratify our desires through ways that God has said we shouldn't, so that we can be a source of life the way that Jesus was. So here's the first thing that we can do to combat that brokenness. Tracking with me? First thing is this. Confess your sin, don't cover it up. Confess your sin, don't cover it up. Look at verse 5 again. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. David's caught. He's caught here. And he has a choice. He can either confess his sin, he can call his sin exactly what God would say it is, or he can make it worse, and he chooses the latter. He brings Bathsheba's husband home from war, hoping that he'll go home and sleep with her. And he doesn't. And so he gets Bathsheba's husband drunk out of his ever-loving mind, hoping that in his drunkenness he'll go home and sleep with her, and he still doesn't. And at this moment, David has a chance to stop this. He's got a chance to stop the cycle that he started. Instead, he perpetuates it, and he does the unthinkable by having Uriah set up to die and murders him so that he can force Bathsheba to become his wife and cover up his sin. And I want you to know that you and I face the exact same temptation today. That when you and I get caught, when we find ourselves in a position where we've done something that God says we shouldn't, we've got a choice. We can either confess it or we can try to cover it up. And I'm telling you, when we try to cover it up, it only makes things worse. But we don't buy that. Would you remember when you were a kid and your parents looked at you and said, always tell the truth? Because if you tell the truth, the consequences won't be as bad. Do you remember that when you were a kid? We didn't buy it then, and we don't buy it now. Even though we tell our kids that. We didn't buy it then, we don't buy it now. We are convinced that it's much better to get away with something than to be caught in it and confess it. And so what we'll do is we'll try to cover it up. So, for example, I have a desire in my heart, a very compelling desire. It's probably one of the biggest desires that I have, to be highly thought of by other people. I want people to think well of me. By the way, that's not a bad desire. That's a biblical desire. However, there have been times where in my desire to be thought highly of by people, I have handled that desire in ways that God would say I shouldn't. So, for example, I've had people come to me and they will ask me to do something for them, and I will do what I'm prone to do, and I will forget to do it for them. Not only that, I'll forget what they asked me to do, and most of the time I'll forget that they even asked me to do something in the first place. And so they will come to me and they will say, hey, did you get done what I asked you to do? That's a panic-inducing moment, if you've ever been there. And in that moment, I've got a choice when I'm having that interaction with someone. I can either confess to them, actually, no, I didn't do it. I didn't even remember that you asked me to do something. Or I can do what I've done numerous times, and I can lie to cover it up. I can make up a story about how busy I was that week. I can make up something that happened that made it so I couldn't do it, all the while trying to get them to hint at what they asked me to do so that I can remember it and then go do it later on. And you have to realize In lying to that person, all I've done is created the potential to make things worse. Because if they find out that I lied to them now, not only did I not value them enough to do what they wanted me to do, and not only did I forget what they asked me to do, but now I've proven myself to be untrustworthy. Instead of confessing and trying to cover it up, I have gone and made things worse. Now, I know that doesn't compare to getting a guy drunk and then murdering him. But I'm trying to get you to see that this temptation to try and cover up your sin does not lead to flourishing. It just leads to more brokenness. Have you ever been there? You ever tried to cover up something that you did and it only made things 100 times worse? That's why covering up our sin is never a good option. That's what happened with David. He tries to cover it up and make things worse when he should have just confessed to what he did. And so instead of trying to get away with it, my encouragement to you is to confess. Like the next time you get caught, confess, don't cover up. Confess, don't cover up. Own up to what you did. Admit that you forgot to do what you were asked. Admit that you lied. Admit whatever it is that you're getting caught in that moment, because if you don't, if you try to cover it up, it's only going to lead to more brokenness and struggle. Now, another way that we can avoid being a source of brokenness, the way that we're talking about, is by building true community into our lives. Do you remember that the third step in forming our identity that's very popular right now, we talked about at the beginning? The third step was surround yourself with a bunch of people who will affirm what you feel and support your pursuits of it. And if anyone counteracts what you feel or your desires, then you need to cut them out of your life. The big temptation and danger that causes in our moment right now, and you see it all over the place, is that you wind up putting yourself in an echo chamber where all you ever hear from people are the things that you want to hear. So here's my suggestion. If you look at the contacts in your phone, or you scroll through your Facebook feed or your Instagram, whatever it is, and all you see are people who look like you, act like you, think like you, and talk like you, you are in a dangerous spot. What we need as human beings is to surround ourselves in our lives with people who are willing to tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear. Look, that's what's going on in verse 5. That's what's going on in verse 3. Remember that question? Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? This is David's community trying to say to him, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. I know what you want to do, and it's not a good idea. Like you know this isn't what God wants for you. You need to cease and desist right now before you get yourself into some trouble. David had some community willing to hold him to what God wanted him to do in his life, even if it was a little bit indirect. And what caused David's problems was he didn't listen to that community. That's why the wisdom of this text is what I just said. It's that you need to surround yourself with people in your life who love Jesus and love you enough to tell you what you need to hear as opposed to what you want to hear. We need people to come into our lives and say, listen, this is not in keeping with what Jesus has for you, because that's not toxic. I'm convinced that some of you actually have some toxic people in your life that it would probably be good for you to cut them out of your life. But someone who is coming to you and saying, hey, I love you and this isn't what Jesus has for you isn't toxic. They're vital. Like they're a source of flourishing and life and healing that you need to be able to follow after Jesus in your life, because that kind of community can keep you from getting into nonsense like David did, and it can pull you out of it. The only reason that David stopped walking in that darkness and started walking in the light is because God sent someone to him to call him out in his nonsense, and he finally responded. True community is made up of people that we trust enough to share our desires and share our feelings, knowing that they love us, love Jesus, and love us and Jesus enough to do what's best for us and hold us accountable to what He has for our lives. And so, do you have people like that in your life? People who you know are wise and love Jesus and want what's best for you and are willing to tell you what you need to hear? Or have you surrounded yourself with a bunch of people who just tell you what you want to hear? Because I can tell you this, the people I appreciate most in my life are the people in this room right now who love me enough to look at me and tell me what I need to hear. I appreciate them much more than I do the people who cheer me on in everything that I want to do. My challenge for you is that if you find yourself in an echo chamber right now, break out of it. Get some people in your life who are willing to tell you what you need to hear as opposed to what you want to hear, because that's how we can be a source of life. This story, as gross as it is, shows us that we can counteract brokenness in the world. We can counteract it by being willing to confess our sin rather than cover it up. And we can counteract brokenness by being willing to build a community into our lives that loves us enough to tell us what we need to hear as opposed to what we want to hear. Which of those steps do you need to take today and moving forward? Let's pray. God, thanks for your grace. I praise you for the fact that one of the things that this story teaches us is that even in our worst moments and our most ridiculous moments, you're still willing to use us, you're still willing to meet us, you're still willing to forgive us, that we can never disqualify ourselves from what you want to do in our lives and in our world. And I pray that in light of that, we would recognize that all the plans you have for our lives and for our desires are good. They are gifts to us. They are not inhibiting, but are leading us into flourishing life. And so would you help us, Holy Spirit, to know and understand your will for our lives? Would you help us to recognize what you tell us to do with our desires and to then live those things out when we're faced with that? I pray that when we fail, because we know we will, that we will confess those things to you openly and willingly, that we won't try to cover it up and perpetuate the sin and the brokenness that we've caused. And I pray that you would surround us with loving brothers and sisters who know what's best, who want what's best for us, who know you well enough to know the difference between the things we actually need and the things we want, that can speak into our lives. Help us to be that for other people as well. Allow us to be a community in our church that encourages one another towards love and good deeds so that we can be a source of life and flourishing and not brokenness and sin. We ask all this in your name, Jesus. Amen.